Episode 6 Queen of the Crow Apes. The next night, the child began asking about Arky even before going to bed. Where did they go when they vanished? What are the metal bars that can make a ring? And is everything in Arky's world here too, but different, like Beta? Almost everything, the mother replied. Some things good, and some not so good. But here in your room there are only your toys, and they are all good, if you take care of them. And I think that you have seen something like Calculus Pigatus in Father's toolbox. Like many of the Inanimati, it too exists in our world, but for other purposes. More of Arky's story, said the child eagerly, rushing to bed and under the covers. The mother sat down. Now, where were we? They disappeared. The mother smiled. Well then, we will begin with the moment they became undisappeared. When the bright light that had blinded him faded, Arky Arch saw that he was alone in a small clearing amidst a dark green jungle on a pleasant sunny day, standing at the edge of a pond of clear water. His friends and the metal device called Calculus Pigatus that brought him here were nowhere to be seen. "Ify! Beta!" he called over and over, but only the hooting of wild animal sounds answered him. "Woo-hoo!" the birds called out. "That's my line," muttered Arky. He saw a sharp edge in the grass that indicated a cliff. The pond drained steadily into a river below by a waterfall descending from the far side. Arky bent over the still, mirror-like pool and looked in. The reflection of himself was there, but it was not the Arky he remembered looking back at him. This was a huge triumphal arch, many times bigger than himself, staring back at him out of the water. "Woohoo! What's happened to me?" Arky asked out loud, and raised one of his legs to get a better look at himself. But as before he had been a small boy of an arch, now he was a huge triumphal arch, almost half as big as his uncle's. "I dunno, Arky," a voice said behind him. "Looks like we sort of grew up all of a sudden." It was Beta, or at least what sounded like Beta, because when Arky turned to greet his friend, he saw not a tiny egg beater, but a large red push lawnmower with gleaming blades. "Beta," Arky exclaimed, "what's happened to us? What's happened to you?" The lawnmower bent its handle forward as if to take in the situation. "Well, I'm a mechanisti, Arky, you know that. And just like you were meant to grow into a big triumphal arch someday, I was meant to be a larger mechanical device too. But I didn't think it could be this. Wow, look at my blades cut!" Beta the lawnmower drove a path around Arky, cutting down the grasses and tall weeds that surrounded them, laughing as he did. "Wee-hee, Arky! Look at me!" Beta called, blades flashing in the sun, grass clippings flying every which way. He was having so much fun buzzing through the high grass that he didn't notice a big palm tree and ran straight into it with a bonk. "Ouch!" cried Beta, rubbing his bent handles together. "Who put a stupid tree here?" he cried, and gave it a kick with his wheels in frustration. The palm tree shook indignantly at his attack, and a big pile of coconuts fell on Beta with a bonkety-bonkety-bonk. "Ooh, Arky," said Beta woozily from below all the coconuts. "Have you got some ice for a big bruise?" "No, better still. I wish you could get me to an icy glacier just so I can take a nice nap on it." And he toppled over again. "Stop clowning around, Beta. Wake up," Arky said. "We need to find Ify. Cut us a road back out of here." Beta shook off his dizziness and immediately began clipping and slicing a path through the foliage. "I think I last heard her over this way," he called over his shoulder, and mowed on so fast that Arky had to run to keep up. But what an enjoyable run it was! "Woohoo!" he called back to the birds in joy. Arky had never felt so strong in his life, and now his pillars were long enough to make great strides, fast enough for the wind to make a whistle as it passed through the inside of his arch, which is called his intrados. He pounded through the jungle behind Beta, but even with his new strength it was hard to keep up with the speeding mechanisti. Suddenly Arky felt a series of great weights topple on him, something that was howling and shrieking and pummeling him with their fists. Arky realized that he was under attack by a tribe of some ferocious animal beings. "Woohoo!" he shouted. "Hey, I'm new here. Can't we be friends?" But the rain of blows only grew stronger, and he thought, these guys want to play rough. Arky twisted this way and that, sending one of his attackers flying over to a hard landing on the jungle floor in front of him. When it stood up, Arky was surprised by what he saw, a fantastical combination of a blue gorilla with the long yellow beak of a bird. "Crow apes!" he shouted to Beta, but the lawnmower was nowhere to be seen. The squawking creature took that chance to leap at his niches and began clawing its way back to Arky's cornice. "Beta, help me get these crow ape crepes off of me!" he shouted in desperation. Arky crashed through the jungle, attempting to shed himself of the clawing beasts, but the fierce crow ape crepes showed no quarter. They kept flinging themselves back onto the pillars of his legs, even as he brushed them off onto the trees speeding past. Soon he was no longer on Beta's path, but recklessly driving towards the cliffs onto the river. The crepe beasts were crawling all over Arky. He could feel them starting to pry apart his stones. If they get into my entablature, they will find the secret message from Trajan, he realized, but he was helpless to throw off the dangerous creatures. All at once he heard a familiar voice. "Look out, Arky! I'm coming through!" And just then Beta came whizzing past his head with a zoom of his whirling mower blades, scattering the horde of crepes as he shaved the top of Arky within a whisker of his cornice. "Thanks, buddy! Woohoo! Whoops, the cliffs!" Arky dug in his pedestals and spun away from the precipice at the last second, causing the final clinging crepe to fall off the cliff edge into the water with a scream from his yellow beak. He shook his fist at Arky as he swam to the opposite shore. "Sorry about that," said Arky as he turned back towards the ponds as Beta circled behind him to keep the howling blue monkeys off their tail. Soon the wails of the creatures were behind them. They were still running when Arky reined himself to a stop, pulling up short as he reached the edge of another small body of water. Beta almost crashed into him in his rush to catch up. "Why did you stop so fast, Arky?" Beta asked. "Those bird-beat baboons were about to—" He froze in mid-sentence as his gaze followed that of Arky to what was waiting before them on the opposite side of the lake. A wall of crepe warriors stood across the water, lining the shore, their spears glinting in the sunlight. In the middle, sitting on a throne carried by her giant guards, was their royal queen. She had a golden crown upon her head and held a baton with a diamond. Arky and Beta stood silent, not knowing what to expect. With their last attackers behind them and these in front, they felt surrounded. "Uh-oh, Arky," said Beta quietly. "We're deep in the crepes now." Arky nodded in agreement, and suddenly hundreds of drums started beating rhythmically, and the blue creatures began chanting just one word, over and over. "Suzette! Suzette! Suzette!" "That must be her name, Arky," said Beta. "Queen Suzette, Suzette, Suzette." "Beta, I think it's just one Suzette," interrupted Arky. "But yes, that's it. We can tell her who we are and explain we have no bad intentions toward them." "Good idea, Arky. I'll wait here," offered Beta. He ended abruptly because all of a sudden the queen raised her baton in the air for silence. The drums and chanting stopped. She began talking at them in a very loud voice, except her language was one that the two friends had never heard, and her words made no sense to them. But while she talked, she swung the baton in the air, gesturing at them and herself. "What is she saying?" asked Beta. "She keeps pointing to her own thumbs and feet." "I don't know either," replied Arky, "but I'm trying to understand something from her gestures." The queen made a figure in the air with her baton. It looked almost like a square. "I think she's talking about Calculus Purgatus. Didn't he make that shape before the gargoyle came?" asked Arky. In fact, it appeared to them as though her baton was tracing all of the shapes the metal bar device had made in the air at Skull Rock. Then, with a final brutal gesture of her baton, the queen made a giant X-shaped crossing motion as if to cancel it all. With that, the drums and chanting began again in a harsh and ugly manner. "What do we do?" Arky asked Beta. "If they can cross this water, we don't have a chance. There's too many of them." "I'll protect you, Beta," said Arky. "But who's going to protect you?" asked his friend, as the drums and voices reached feverish pitch. Suddenly, Arky cried out, "Woohoo! Look, Beta!" and gestured towards the crepe troops. Behind the chanting animals, something big was coming, rising up from the distance, growing nearer and nearer, towering over the jungle treetops. A colossal figure appeared, and it moved menacingly towards them. The crepes suddenly noticed this surprise from the rear and scattered left and right in a mad rush, the guards carrying Queen Suzette almost dropping her throne in their hurry. In a few seconds they were gone, and only the small patch of quiet water lay between the two adventurers and the advancing giant. It came to the edge of the clearing and stopped, towering over the trees. It wavered back and forth and regarded them curiously. Finally, they could see what had frightened the queen and her army. There, in front of them, stood the most beautiful tower they had ever seen. 3 long and graceful legs swept up through a narrow waist to an elegant circular rotunda. A spiky antenna topped it off provocatively. "What is it?" asked Beta in a trembling voice. "I don't know, Beta," Arky replied, "but something about it looks really familiar." "And what was it?" the child asked excitedly. "We will find that out tomorrow, but I think you will soon guess." "What was the queen saying to Arky and Beta? Why couldn't they understand her?" "You should know that just because a person talks, it does not mean that they are understood. The crepes think if they shout louder, anyone can follow what they are saying." "What did the monkey people want to tell them?" "Not monkeys, crow-apes," the mother corrected. "I believe they were upset to find Calculus Pigatus had returned to their lands. You see, Queen Suzette and her tribe of crepes do not believe in absolute measurements with precision such as Pigatus uses. For those like them, that is much too complicated. They like simpler numbering methods. Even our word digit comes from an old word for finger or toe, and the crepes believe that the size of Queen Suzette's thumbs is good enough to measure anything small, and the size of her royal feet is the right way to measure anything big." "How big, Mummy?" "Well, I suppose with enough of her steps you could get to the moon." "And is that bad?" the child asked. "Oh no, in their jungle it's quite sufficient, even if it is sometimes a bit confusing," the mother replied with a laugh. "Every time they want to find out how far away or how big something is, they discover the queen has been losing or gaining weight, which causes her feet and thumbs to swell or shrink quite unpredictably. But far worse than that, they will not consider any alternative to her royal dimensions. They are beasts of herd mentality that rush to attack all who believe differently, as they did with Arky and Beta. The queen was describing that Calculus Pigatus was an unacceptable tool, whose numbers were violating their rules, and everyone using it was to be chased out of their kingdom." "How do you know what they were saying, Mummy?" asked the child. "Mothers must know many things, especially ones who tell long stories of the inanimati. Now hush and go to sleep, and try to imagine who the tall stranger across the water might be." And with that, she gave her child a kiss, turned out the light, and shut the door.